All right. So in front of me here is the Keyboardio Model 100. It is a split ergonomic keyboard with a wooden look. And the best summary for this keyboard is that although I do think the keyboard has a couple of design flaws, I also think it's one of the most underappreciated keyboards in the ergonomic space. The point of this video is to explain all of this. And the place where I'll just get started is just the physical hardware and the design. Now, right off the bat, one cute thing that this keyboard tries to look like is a butterfly. When you kind of hold both halves together like so, it's kind of a butterfly shape. And the butterfly shape is there because that's the logo of the company. The company name is Keyboardio and they have a butterfly logo. But it's not the only thing that you're going to notice right off the bat. One thing you should also notice is that this is a column staggered layout, so the buttons are laid out in such a way that I can get my fingers moving forward and backwards, and it's really in this column direction that the keys are moving that has ergonomic properties to it. What you can also see is that there are these buttons for your thumb, so it's not the single space bar. Each thumb has access to 4 buttons that I would argue are pretty normal to reach. But then smack dab over here, there's also a palm button. Now, the design thinking of that button is that it basically gives you an extra axis of freedom. You can keep your palm down, so to say, and that gives you an extra button, maybe for layers or for some shortcuts, stuff you do very often. That is something they've also added to this design. So that's the basic layout of it. So let's talk about what works and what doesn't. Right off the bat, one thing I will say is that this palm button doesn't work for me. I just found it was slightly awkward and even slightly uncomfortable to have that palm button there and to actually go ahead and use it. It felt more comfortable to just use these thumb buttons instead. And you've got 4 per thumb, so it definitely felt like I've already got plenty of degrees of freedom here. What I ended up doing, because I did want to give this keyboard a proper spin, is I just manually removed these palm buttons. And in doing so, basically, my thumb can still move kind of freely. You just have this exposed switch over here that's, I guess, a downside. I would love to cover that up. But actually, that solved all of my issues I had with it. So, also because I don't look at my keyboard, I kind of look straight when I'm typing. I was actually totally cool with not having those palm buttons there. In a way, no harm, no foul. Bit of a shame with the exposed switch, but that's it. Then, you start typing, you start giving this keyboard a proper spin, and then you start noticing that, for a large extent, your first glance might be that the design of this keyboard is the butterfly shape and the fact that it's made out of wood. It feels like that's the design property. But on closer inspection, it really isn't. The real unique thing about this keyboard is the keycaps. Now, I'm going to be hovering the keyboard just a little bit slowly, and hopefully the light will also make it clear what's kind of unique about the keycaps. But you can see that every keycap on this keyboard is specifically sculpted. And just to highlight a few of those sculpted properties, you're going to notice that on top over here, there's a couple of buttons that are very long, and the buttons in the middle are actually kind of short. Now, why might you do that? Well, you can definitely imagine that for your pinky to reach the one button, usually that's a very long stretch, simply because your pinky is quite short. But by making the button over here for your pinky much longer, your pinky can actually maybe hit the bottom bit of that button, and that's actually kind of still comfortable. And it's that kind of thinking, positioning of your hand. A lot of that logic, that's actually being handled by the keycap and not necessarily by the layout design of the keyboard itself. It's the keycaps that are doing most of the work. And there's like a couple of details I just want to highlight. So you're going to have to squint your eyes a bit on this one, but I think if I have the lights like so, you're going to see it. But on close inspection, you should be able to see that I have this one button over here that has a nib on it, and another button over there that has a nib on it. And that's quite normal for the home row. Normally you have a nib on the F and the J button, so when you put your finger on it, you know what the resting position should be. But by also having that nib for your pinky finger, it's a lot easier to navigate and to say, I'm in the home position, my hand is at the right spot. And as an extra bonus, they also have one button with a nib here for your thumb. Now that button, I do think, even though it's cool to add a nib on a thumb button, it's like definitely a nice touch, I love that. But the downside is that that particular button, the nib is at the bottom side of the button. And when your thumb is resting on it, it's kind of resting more on top of it. So I have found that, might be due to my hand shape, I actually don't feel the nib on the thumb button, which I would love to have felt. But just the fact that, it's a bit of a quirky thing, but just the fact that your pinky and your index finger both have homing row nibs, I'm used to customizing my own keyboards to allow for that, and the fact that this just comes with it, I will say, love it. Really, really nice touch. Now, a thing about the keycaps as well, and hopefully if I hold it like this, it's kind of clear. You can see that the keycaps in the middle are actually a fair bit lower than the keycaps at the edges over here. I'm going to make a comparison to a board that has a keywell, and it's not necessarily a fair comparison because this board, the Glove 80, really has sort of an extreme keywell, and that's also what causes a lot of the comfort. But you can definitely maybe imagine that if you have a keywell, your fingers can kind of fall more into it, and also there's like less travel distance to go from one button to the next one, just because you've got the angle and there's like less travel distance that way. Again, it's not a one-to-one comparison. The Glove 80 is definitely a very different experience in the comfort department. But hopefully you can imagine that by having some of these keycaps be lower and some of them be higher, part of the equation here is that that's more comfortable. But another thing that's also interesting about the design of these keycaps is that they also kind of come with sharp edges. So let me just show you this one keycap over here. You'll notice if I turn it, there's actually this sharp edge at the end. There's like, you can really rest your finger in there easily. But if you were to move your finger left and right, there's this really, really sharp edge that it's going to fall out of. That actually makes it quite easy to navigate. And it sounds weird maybe, but hopefully you can imagine that if you're looking for, the next button over, the combination of, you've always got one finger on the resting position for the home row nib, and it's also very easy to feel where your finger is just because all the edges are so sharp. And there's also height differences and all that. All of that makes it pretty easy to just, on a tactile level, feel where the buttons are supposed to be. And that's something I kind of miss with some of the other keyboards. If I were to contrast that with the Voyager, which is by a lot of means like a really great board, all the buttons really do kind of feel the same. Like if I were like this button over here or this button over there, they just feel the same. But these buttons don't. And something about that makes navigating pretty easy, and after a while it starts getting really intuitive. If you're into touch typing, I honestly think that these keycaps can help in that department too. You could argue that the keycaps, because they're so specific, they also kind of come with a downside. You cannot really customize this board. I got this board secondhand with lots of different styles of keycaps, so I can always go ahead and swap them. But it is good to know that if you want to have a spare, you cannot just use a random keycap. You are going to have to buy a whole new full set, and you can see that as a downside, I suppose. Now, one final thing about the keycaps actually is where all of your normal, like pinky up until your index finger, all of those fingers have these sharp edges, but your thumb, they actually get these soft buttons. So it's really easy to sort of move around and pick the button you like. I think the reason they did that is just having a more round shape for a thumb that really likes to move in an arc makes it more comfortable. Imagine having a finger that can only really move in an arc motion and then having sharp edges, like that would not be comfortable. I think that's the reason why they made it round. But the most important thing here really is that you really do get 4 buttons that are, at least to my hands, really easy to press. And that's kind of rare. Sometimes you get 2 buttons, sometimes you get 3, but I think this is the first board where you don't have to do any modification whatsoever to get 4 buttons that are just super comfortable to reach right out the bat. So there you go. Something that's really cool about this board is actually not necessarily the board itself, but the keycaps. And that is something I didn't expect going into this. I definitely appreciated the sort of pinky stagger that also makes it kind of a nice resting position for your hand. You can see that it's not necessarily a straight row line. Definitely the pinky keys over here, they are moved down significantly, which makes it easier for your pinky to reach. But I do want to talk about the body for a bit, because I do think the body comes with maybe downsides that I do want to mention, honestly. I mentioned in the beginning that when you put both keyboards together, they kind of look like the logo. It looks like a butterfly. It's probably more ergonomic if you split it, but because they want it to look like a butterfly, you do get this shape, and in particular, you get this edge over here. Now, the thing with that edge is when I put my hand there, the comfortable resting position for me, my hand definitely is kind of more at the edge here. And for my hands, I can say that it's actually kind of just fine. But if I imagine having hands that are just slightly larger, you are going to get into this awkward scenario where maybe your wrist is going to be fully exposed onto that ledge, so to say. And that's going to cause uncomfort. I think my hands are probably still fine. And if you are at the edge, your hand is just going to slightly move inward more to compensate, I guess. All this stuff, it depends on your hand size, I suppose. I just think it would have been a safer bet if maybe there would just be a little bit more wood here, just so there's maybe more place for your hands to rest. A keyboard doesn't necessarily have to be in the shape of your logo. Maybe having more comfort would have been a better design decision there. A second downside of the body, I suppose, is while I do really appreciate the wood look, you can get it in multiple colors and, looks pretty good. You do get a keyboard that is relatively thick as well. I think part of the story here is that they want to kind of have this keywell effect. So that probably means that they also want to have some keycaps that are much lower than others, and they kind of have the keycaps somewhere in the middle over here. So it might be the case that I need that height to get that little keywell effect going. That might be a design reason. I just think it would have been preferable if this was more flat. Partially because if you keep the keyboard flat on your desk, and let's say you put a little trackpad in the middle there, it would be just kind of nice if you can move your hand over and not have to move it down and then back up again. Something about that inch of height difference, it's not a huge pain or anything like that, but it does feel a bit awkward. Because if you do have something in the middle, it can be the awkward case that your desk is well suited for your keyboard and not for your trackpad, and vice versa. Whereas if you had a very flat board, the trackpad and your keyboard would have been the same height. This keyboard also has a couple of other features, and those features can only be shown by also showing you the software. So I'm going to basically plug everything in now. By the way that you plug this in is basically with this Ethernet cable. That's the way you connect both halves. Once both halves are connected, you can also connect the leftmost half with just a normal USB-C cable. And when you do, the keyboard will light up. And now that the keyboard lights up, I can also go to the configuration software. Now, the configuration software is based on this SDK called Chrysalis. And if you go to chrysalis.keyboard.io, you get this web configurator that really allows you to configure the keyboard just from your browser. It uses Web USB for that, I think. I would argue it's pretty straightforward. It's also pretty intuitive. You just hit connect. You tell the browser that indeed you want your USB device to connect to this web app. The Model 100 is detected, and Bob's your uncle, you're in. From here, you can configure the LEDs, just like you can configure specific functionalities, specific buttons. So just to give the quickest demo, hey, let's actually turn the LEDs off for these palm buttons because I'm not going to be using them. So I go to the LED section over here. I have this pressed. Let's just turn that black, and let's also do that there. That looks pretty good. Let's hit Save Changes. And there we go. It's flashed. You can now see that the LED for this button is no longer glowing. Okay. That's how you configure this. It's pretty straightforward. No need to have a separate flashing step or anything like that. So that part of the configurator is definitely super nice. And I will also say, the basics are also pretty well covered. So one thing I really like to have are these things called home row modifications. They allow me to keep my hand on the home row, but still have access to all sorts of functionality. So, for example, if I just tap F, I get the F character. But if I keep this pressed down, then I trigger Shift. This is something that's known as a home row modification. That's something you can totally configure. I go to the F key over here. You can see that F is selected on the keyboard down below. And you can also see, if I go to the modifier tab over here, there is a secondary action that I can attach. And I can say when held, I want to have a modifier, namely the Shift button. And similarly, I can also go to this button over here. There's nothing on the keyboard that it does, but I can go to my layers tab over here. And when this button is pressed, I'm going to shift to a layer. There's all sorts of things you can click together here, and it's pretty intuitive. But there is this one upside I want to talk about in terms of this software that I actually think is relatively unique. There's few other boards that do this well. And that is that I have this special configuration for my mouse layer. You see, when I have this one button pressed down for long, then on my right hand, I can actually move the mouse cursor. So up, down, left, right, and I can also mouse click. That's also something I can do with my right hand now. And I just really kind of like it to be able to control the mouse. That's just, there are these moments when I need to use the mouse because my app doesn't allow me to do anything else. And if I can just do everything from my keyboard, that just really makes my day. So for those moments, I really like to have some mouse support on my keyboard. And here's the thing. Normally with these keyboards, if I move the mouse, there's a very constant velocity. It can only move in one direction at a specific pace. It cannot go faster or slower. This is something I really appreciated from the Ultimate Hacking keyboard. That has its own custom software with support for this accelerate button that allows me to sort of keep an extra button pressed, and then the mouse would move faster or slower. The way that this Keyboardio keyboard actually goes about it is if you move your mouse in the same direction and you keep the mouse button pressed, then it can accelerate. And I will say that totally works for me. There are these moments when I want the button to go just right where it needs to be because I want to hit like a specific button, let's say. And there are these moments when I just need the thing to move to the other side of the screen real quick. And the fact that like the speed is something you can configure and tune and stuff, but the fact that that's the way that they go about the mouse support, big thumbs up on my end. I pretty much think it's on par with the mouse support of the Ultimate Hacking keyboard, and I totally didn't expect that. I can imagine that this isn't necessarily a feature that everyone is going to love as much as I do, but I have personally found like the RSI issues that I always had, a lot of them were caused by trackpad work, like when you're doing a presentation and like that's the thing that really hurts. Being able to move that away from the trackpad and more onto the keyboard was definitely like a thing that helped me. So I like seeing that in keyboards, and yeah, this really feels well done. That said, there is a downside of the configurator though that I also just briefly want to mention. As I said before, I do have this thing called a home row modification. So that means that this keyboard will have to distinguish between just quickly pressing a button, like hitting F, and keeping a button pressed down, which means shift. So there's a timing issue there. And for a lot of custom board software, the timing there is something that you can configure. In fact, there's a couple of these open source boards that use Vial that also make it pretty easy for you to configure the timing. But that, unfortunately, is something that you can't configure in this software. What you can do is you can move on to preferences here, and you can find, pretty useful stuff, I would still say. There's things like the brightness of your LEDs. They have a feature called sticky keys, and there's settings for that, and, stuff for the mouse keys, and all that stuff is good. But there's no current way to configure the timing. I glanced at some forums, and I also saw some other videos on YouTube, and it seems to be the case that if you're willing to do code yourself, you can actually go a layer deeper and actually configure that stuff manually. But I'm simply not willing to learn an SDK just to configure my keyboard. I want to declare this like a missing feature. Like if they would add this timing feature, I think a lot more people could use this keyboard because the timing thing can be annoying. It would be nicer if the keyboard can adapt to you as opposed to you having to adapt to the keyboard. So, having said all that, I do think the software, besides that one point, is pretty fine. It's not the most intuitive software to use, but then again, it's still pretty intuitive. It's just a lot of clicking you got to do. And the fact that flashing the thing is easy, that's also a big plus in my book. So that's what you can expect from the software. Now, there's one extra thing I want to talk about. The keyboard has enough buttons. There's 3 buttons on the side over here that I've not found a use case for, but I can definitely imagine layer toggles. There's all sorts of cool things you can do here. But if you're thinking about ergonomics, one thing that is also nice to mention is that the keyboard is hot swappable. So the switches that go in here, you can replace them with something that you prefer. In my mind, lighter switches are probably better for your ergonomics. So I put very lightweight tactile switches in this thing. But another thing that, I don't know if the science has actually proven this, but one thing I can confirm can make it more comfortable is tenting. So the thinking is that it's a bit unnatural for your hand to rest like this on your keyboard. This is maybe a little bit more natural. So something about that angle is something that you can improve by maybe tilting the board a bit more like this. Now, the company, Keyboardio, also sells you some accessories. And in particular, if you want to get a tilting kit, this is what it looks like. You basically get these 2 big cogs, and there's a screw at the bottom here that you can actually screw in at the bottom here. So I'm just going to do that for one of the boards here. Hopefully the point will then be clear as well. So, okay, it's pretty easy to screw in. What you can then do is you can turn this around such that you have the perfect angle that you like. And there you kind of go. It's there. But you will notice that the tilting angle is actually not that high. It's maybe like 5, maybe 10 degrees. But having this thing under here definitely introduces some extra height. It basically moves the keyboard up a bit. But not only that, all right? So there we go. Second keyboard now with the cog under it. So, you can still move stuff around, and that's fine. But now imagine I have something in the middle of my keyboard. In my case, it's typically this drawing tablet that I like to use when I make demos. That allows me to grab my pen, and it allows me to draw around and stuff. But you will now notice that the legs of the cog, they cannot touch this board, so they kind of have to be further away from each other. And, at some point, you're really gonna broaden your shoulders up a bit. And, I guess this could work, but at the same time, it also kind of feels forced. And I was kind of wondering, well, can I maybe come up with an alternative for this system that has maybe less downsides? What you can actually go and do is you can use any camera holding equipment including this Manfrotto pocket. It's a very likable thing for tenting of your keyboards as well. You just need to get a proper coin, then you can screw it in too. All right, there we go. But the main thing to notice is that I am able to sort of put legs under this thing, and I could put the legs just where I want them to be, and this side will basically just be able to float over whatever is under it. And it's a little thing, but I have noticed that this actually does give you a fair amount of space. Another benefit of this approach is that you have these two legs, and those two legs can actually be moved around, which will also allow you to increase or decrease the tenting angle. You're still able to move it around, so you can still have it like be very shoulder out styled, so to say. But just the fact that you've got space under it, and the fact that you can actually tune the angle a bit more, it does make me comfortable saying that if you're interested in doing proper tenting with this, to maybe not get the official tenting kit and instead go for a system like this. There's also other tenting solutions. It's just for most of my keyboard use, I have found this Manfrotto brand to just be excellent. A final thing that is maybe good to mention as well is that there are also accessories that you can get. So I have actually bought this thing secondhand, and it came with this Keyboardio bag. I will say the bag is quite thick. There's a lot of space inside of it, but this will take up a good chunk of your bag if you're going to be carrying this with you. But there we are. All in all, this is a interesting keyboard. I am comfortable saying that the keyboard has some design decisions that don't really work well for me. At the same time, I'm also comfortable saying that that design decision when it comes to the keycaps, that is underappreciated. I have not seen any other keyboard provider dare kind of go in that direction, but I can confirm that it just works. It definitely feels like there's something underappreciated going on here. I don't feel like I want to part with this keyboard just yet, because I do think it's one of the more comfortable MX-style keyboards that I've used. But I am secretly hoping that maybe some other keyboard designers are also interested in taking this keycap approach and maybe properly running with it as well, because there is something to really like about it. To me, you're going to want to ignore the palm buttons. It will be nicer if maybe the shape was a bit different, because then your palms could rest properly a bit more. But until other keyboard makers actually start thinking about these keycaps a bit more, I think it's also safe to say that the Keyboardio Model 100 is also underappreciated. And it's an interesting mix. Like, it's a very unexpected keyboard in a kind of a good way.